All right, let's go. Number 10. The pit traps of Hatsunegahara. On a gravel terrace above the city of Mishima, at the eastern foot of the Hakone volcano, archaeologists stripped the topsoil off a site called Hatsunegahara and found holes. Not a scatter of them. Rows. The pits run in double and triple lines across the terrace for more than 150 meters. And the city's own survey puts the total at over 100. Each one is about 1.4 meters across and about 1.5 meters deep. Several open at the top in a trumpet shape. They were cut into loose volcanic soil by people with no metal, no pottery, and no agriculture of any kind. The published estimate for the site is around 32,000 years ago. That figure does not come from radiocarbon. It comes from ash. Roughly 30,000 years ago, the Era caldera at the southern end of Kyushu erupted and threw a layer of tephra across the entire archipelago. That layer is now the most useful line in Japanese prehistory. Anything sealed beneath it is older than the eruption. The pits are beneath it. They are also not unusual. Shizuoka Prefecture had recorded 255 Paleolithic pit traps by the spring of 2022, which is 63% of the 402 known in the whole country. There are more at Fuji-ishi in Nagaizumi, at Tsukamatsu in Susanoo at Higashino. On the island of Tanegashima, the Tachikiri site has pits in layers older than 35,000 years. This is not one clever idea at one location. It is a regional habit sustained across the last ice age. But here is where the record goes quiet. Not one of these pits has produced an animal bone. No projectile points. No butchery marks. No burnt layer from a fire lit over a carcass. Nothing at all that would say what walked into the hole. The traps are empty, and they always have been. So the case that they are traps rests entirely on shape and position. A storage pit is dug beside a camp. A post hole holds a post. Neither one is cut in a line across the neck of a ridge, at the point where an animal moving through broken country has nowhere else to go. These pits sit where the terrain squeezes. The prey identification is thinner still. Japanese archaeologists read the dimensions and conclude that the target was medium-sized game deer and wild boar because that is the size of animal the hole fits. That is an inference drawn from a hole. We have no gut contents, no kill surface, no cut mark on anything. The claim usually attached to these sites is that they are the oldest hunting traps in the world. The prefecture's own wording is more careful and worth repeating. Exactly no comparable examples have been found overseas. That is an argument from absence, not a measurement. The nearest European pitfalls in the Marne are Mesolithic, roughly 11,000 years old. Younger by 20,000 years on a continent dug over far more thoroughly. What a line of pits does to a landscape is different in kind from what a hunting party does. A hunt is an event. A pit line is a condition. Once it is dug and kept open, the ridge itself has changed, and every animal using the natural route walks through a filter, whether or not a single person is standing there. Multiply that by 255 traps in one prefecture, and the unsettling arithmetic starts to show. 30,000 years later, the holes are still legible in section dark fills against pale gravel cut sharply enough to measure with a tape. What is missing is the disturbing part. The tools that dug them have not survived. The people who cut them are unknown. Not one tooth of one deer has ever come out of a single pit. We are looking at a machine and at nothing that ever went into it. Number 9. The net that left only its shadow. The object is a piece of fired clay from Moravia in the Czech Republic, and it is not much to look at. What matters is the surface. Pressed into it in Negev is the structure of a woven fiber object that rotted away tens of thousands of years ago. The sites are Pavlov and Dolní Věstonice, excavated over decades, most famously by Bohuslav Klima of the Czech Academy of Sciences. In 1996, James Adavasio, Olga Sofer, and Klima published the finds in the journal Antiquity. Clay had been pressed against mats, cordage, and textiles while it was still soft, and a fire baked the impression permanently into it. The fiber burned away. The picture of the fiber survived. The published age at the time was around 26,000 to 27,000 radiocarbon years. A redating program in 2019 put the main occupation of these sites between roughly 31,000 and 29,000 calendar years ago. Either figure places this deep inside the last ice age, far older than anyone expected fiber technology to be. What makes the impressions extraordinary is not the date. It is the regularity. The weaves are consistent in gauge, structured in more than one pattern, and cut with the evenness of work done many times before. This is not a first attempt at anything. Whatever tradition stands behind it was already old when the clay touched it, and everything before that point is invisible to us. Among the structures the team identified was netting. A net is a different sort of weapon, and the difference is not about power. A thrown spear takes one animal chosen by a person strong enough to throw it. A net takes whatever runs into it. It can be set by anyone, and it keeps working while the people who made it are somewhere else. It changes who in a group can bring back food, and it changes which animals are worth chasing at all. That is a different economy. There is a separate line of evidence about what happens when that becomes routine, and it comes from the far end of Europe. Mary Steiner, Natalie Monroe, and Todd Survival published work in Science in 1999 and in Current Anthropology the following year on small animal bones from Mediterranean sites. The pattern runs one way. Slow, easily gathered prey tortoises and shellfish dominate the early assemblages, then give ground to fast, hard-to-catch prey hares and partridges and other birds. The tortoises also get smaller through the sequence. That is the classic signature of a population being harvested faster than it can replace itself. It is one of the few places in the Paleolithic where pressure on an animal population can be measured rather than assumed. Their reading is that human numbers were rising and diets were widening under that pressure. Fast, small game is only worth pursuing with a way to take it in quantity, and the ways available are traps, snares, and nets. Those two lines have to be kept apart because they are not the same evidence. Moravia shows that the technology existed. The Mediterranean bones show what a prey base looks like under sustained small game pressure. We have not connected one directly to the other, and the distance between them is most of Europe. And there is a harder limit than that. No net has ever been recovered from this period. Not one anywhere. Distinguishing knotted netting from fine twining in a negative impression is genuinely difficult. And the leap from netting existing to nets being used for hunting is an argument built on ethnography largely from net hunting communities in the Congo Basin. It is reasonable. It is not demonstrated. So the technology that may have rewritten the bottom of the food web reaches us as a haunting sort of accident. Somebody set a fire on a floor that had a mat lying on it 30,000 years ago, and the heat turned a texture into a fossil. Everything we know about the oldest capture device in this countdown comes from the mud that happened to be touching it. Number 8. The Uvda Valley leopard traps. In 2013, Naomi Porat Uzi, Avner Asaf Holzer, Rahamim Shemtov, and Leora Kolska-Horwitz published a survey in the journal Antiquity. Their subject was a group of stone structures in the Uvda Valley in the southern Negev desert of Israel. They recorded 23 of them, 13 large and 10 small. 19 sit inside a single block of 20 square kilometers, which is the highest density of these structures known anywhere in the Near East. They are built, not dug. Two parallel walls of upright stones roofed with heavy cover slabs closed at one end and open at the other. The large ones are 2 to 4 meters long and 1.5 to 2.5 meters wide. Inside the chamber narrows to about 40 centimeters across and 50 centimeters high. The small ones are around 1.5 meters by a meter, with an internal passage as tight as 15 centimeters. Set into a narrow gap in the roof is a vertical stone slab held up by a rope. That slab is the whole design. Bait goes at the closed end. To reach it, an animal has to push into a stone corridor, barely wider than its own shoulders. It cannot turn around. It cannot back out at speed. It cannot bring its claws to bear on anything. Knocking the bait loose releases the rope and the slab drops behind it. It is a brutal piece of engineering, and it works in a very narrow way. Nothing about it is designed to kill. Everything about it is designed to hold. The dating was done by optically stimulated luminescence. on sediment inside the structures, a method that measures how long mineral grains have been shielded from sunlight. One trap cataloged, BU-160, returned a spread of ages running from about 6,500 years down to 270. A single grain analysis of the lowest sample gave 5,260 years, give or take 240, which places construction in the Chalcolithic in the 4th millennium BC. The authors are careful about what that spread means, and we should be too. Every sediment layer inside a standing stone box contains grains blown in across centuries, so the ages smear. There is no way to know how long the trap stood empty before sediment began to settle in it at all. The date is a floor, not a moment. The species list the authors propose is leopard, wolf, caracal, fox, hyena, and possibly cheetah, which makes this the first trap in the countdown that was not built to get food. Herding reached this desert around 6000 BC. Sheep and goats moving in small flocks across a landscape with almost no cover and very little water. In that arrangement, a predator is not prey, and it is not a rival for prey either. It is a direct tax on the herd, and it takes exactly the animals a family cannot afford to lose. The traps are not clustered near good hunting ground. They are clustered near grazing. It is protection, not predation. Taking predators out of a landscape is one of the most powerful things people can do to it. Modern ecology has measured this repeatedly with wolves and with large cats, and we can watch the effects run downhill through herbivore, behavior browsing pressure, and plant communities. What does not exist for the Chalcolithic Negev is that data set. There is no pollen sequence and no bone series that would let us say what several thousand years of predator removal did to this particular desert, and pretending otherwise would be inventing an ecosystem to fit a structure. What can be said is that the machine was extraordinarily durable. That spread of luminescence dates is not a flaw in the method. It is the record of a stone box that stayed standing and stayed functional and went on being used for something close to 5,000 years. The people using it at the end arrived long after whoever built it had gone. The design was never improved because it never needed to be. The Arabian leopard is now one of the rarest large cats on Earth. Somewhere in that valley, the traps are still there. Roofs on chambers clear. The drop slabs long since fallen or lifted out. They outlasted the animal they were shaped around. Number 7. The fish weir that required a managed forest. Off the Danish island of Nexelo in Sagero Bay, a hazel rod stands upright in the seabed where somebody hammered it into the mud 5,000 years ago. It is not alone. Around it in water, more than 4 meters deep, are the remains of fishing structures running at least 200 to 250 meters out from where the shoreline used to be. Anders Fischer and Jesper Olsen published the chronology in the journal Radiocarbon in 2021. The anchor structure is a hazel weir about 5,200 years old. 18 radiocarbon dates on construction wood from the complex spread across the late Ertabola and the early Neolithic clustering in the centuries around 3000 BC. The scale of one of these is easy to underestimate. Lisbeth Pedersen Fischer and the wood specialist Thomas Bartholin estimated that a single weir required something like 6 to 8,000 horizontal hazel rods, woven through roughly 500 vertical posts driven into the seafloor. A wattle panel, 40 meters long, survives on the bottom. One section still stands 4 meters proud of the seabed. But here is where a fish trap stops being a fish trap. We tend to picture a trap as something a person makes in an afternoon. Look instead at the rods. They are straight. They are uniform. They run to 2 or 3 centimeters thick through uprights of about 5,000 of them matched closely enough to weave. Wood like that does not grow in a wild forest. Wild hazel is crooked-branched and inconsistent, and anyone cutting it needs days to find enough usable lengths for one panel. Uniform rods come from coppicing. A hazel stool is cut down to ground level, and instead of dying, it throws up a crop of straight shoots from the stump. Those are harvested on a fixed cycle, and the stool is cut again. Done once, that is firewood. Done on a rotation across a whole wood for generations. it becomes a permanent crop. The team's estimate is that keeping this weir standing required roughly 40 hectares of hazel worked on a 7 to 10-year rotation. That is the trap changing the ecosystem, and the change is not in the water. It is on the land. 40 hectares of woodland held permanently in a species composition and an age structure that would never occur without people, and held there not to feed anyone but to supply a structure standing out in the sea. The earliest large-scale woodland management we know of in Europe exists because of a fish trap. The Danish record around it is unusually dense. At Kalovig, the earliest weir remains in the country date to around 6,450 BC, some 8,500 years ago. At the submerged settlement of Tibrand, Vig occupied for well over 1,000 years. Excavators recovered around 250 sharpened hazel rods over 2 meters long, dozens of thicker uprights, a limewood logboat 9.5 meters long, and ash paddles with geometric decoration cut into the blades. Then there is Siltholm Fjord, on Lolland, drained and excavated between 2012 and 2022, ahead of the Fehmarn Belt Tunnel. It produced 4 preserved sections of wattle, weir 5 fish trap remains, and thousands of stakes spanning roughly 4,700 to 900 BC. The traps were built from red dogwood, hazel, alder, willow, pine root, and Gelder rose, bound with fiber stripped from tree bast. Different woods for different jobs. What that sequence shows is a technology that did not stop when farming arrived. It ran straight through the transition and out the other side into the Bronze Age. Across nearly 4,000 years of it, the dominant fish species in the assemblages stay consistent with no sign anywhere of a stock being emptied. The pressure shows up somewhere else entirely. Over the same span, the overall richness of species in the fjord declines, and the researchers put that down to intensified human presence across the landscape, rather than to the fishing itself. The trap was not the problem. The people who needed the trap were. The weir is still down there, and it is a haunting thing to see on a survey photograph. Every rod in it was grown on purpose on a schedule by people who farmed a wood in one place so they could take a fish in another. Number 6. The Mammoth Pits at Tultepec. In late 2019, the Mexican National Institute of Anthropology and History announced the results of 10 months of salvage excavation at Tultepec, in the state of Mexico, a short distance north of Mexico City. The dig had been triggered by construction work on a landfill. The team came from the Institute's Rescue Archaeology Directorate, led by Luis Cordoba Baradas, and by the time they finished, they had moved something like 400 cubic meters of earth. They found 2 pits, and in them 824 bones, 8 skulls, 5 jaws, 100 vertebrae, 179 ribs. The minimum number of animals represented is 14. Alongside them lay about a dozen horse bones and a few from camel, both of which lived in the basin of Mexico at the time. They are not woolly mammoths, whatever the coverage said at the time. They are Colombian mammoths, Mammuthus columbi, a larger and far less hairy animal adapted to temperate and subtropical grassland. The identification is confirmed in 2 later peer-reviewed studies of teeth and diet from this exact site. The age is around 15,000 years. In a basin where a Popocatépetl eruption at about 14,700 years ago leaves a usable marker layer to work from. The interpretation offered was that these were traps. Hunters, the reconstruction goes, drove the animals in using torches and branches. That is the claim. The problem is the shape of the holes. Each pit is 25 meters across and 1.7 meters deep, with walls cut at 90 degrees. Those 2 numbers pull in opposite directions. Vertical walls in soft lake sediment are a strong argument that people dug this because water and slumping do not produce a right angle and then hold it. A depth of 1.7 meters is a weak argument that anything was held in it. That is not a shaft. It is a flat-bottom pan wider than a tennis court and barely deeper than a person is tall. And a Colombian mammoth stood well over 3 meters at the shoulder. An animal that size does not fall into something like that. It steps down into it. 10 kilometers away at the Santa Lucia site, excavated ahead of a new airport. The same institute recovered the remains of around 60 mammoths. Those animals were interpreted very differently. The archaeologist Pedro Sanchez Nava attributed them to becoming mired in soft mud on the shore of the ancient Lake Xaltocan, with people possibly scavenging the carcasses afterwards. So, a natural mass death mechanism for mammoths is documented in the same basin, in the same period 10 kilometers from the pits. That is not proof of anything. It is a reminder that this landscape was killing mammoths without any help. There is a further limit, and it is the important one. No peer-reviewed publication has yet presented the case that these pits are human-built traps. Adam Roundtree of the University of Michigan said so publicly at the time in the mildest possible terms, noting that researchers were looking forward to seeing the evidence in print. Every peer-reviewed paper to come out of Tultepec since has been about mammoth teeth and mammoth diet. 7 years on, we are still waiting. The stakes here run far past one site. Whether people in the Americas killed proboscideans systematically, or scavenged them opportunistically, or simply shared a continent with them while the climate did the work, is the longest-running argument in Pleistocene archaeology. The Columbian mammoth is gone from the continent within a few thousand years of the date on these bones, along with most other American animals over a ton. What hangs on it is the disturbing question underneath the whole field, which is whether our species arrives in a new landmass as a participant or as an event. 2 engineered pits holding 14 mammoths would be the most direct physical evidence anyone has produced for organized killing at that scale, if they are pits. We have the bones cataloged and studied. We have the holes measured and mapped. What we do not have is the sentence that joins them, and at the moment, the only one on offer is in a press bulletin. 14 animals, 824 bones, 2 flat depressions in old lake mud, and no way yet to say whether what put them there was a plan or a swamp. Number 5. The pits that mapped a vanished migration. Norway has more than 50,000 recorded trapping pits. Sweden has more than 30,000 in its National Heritage Database. Taken together, that is the largest surviving prehistoric hunting infrastructure anywhere on Earth. And almost nobody outside Scandinavia has ever heard of it. Individually, they are simple things. A pit sometimes lined with stone, sometimes with a wooden frame set inside it. 70 to 90 centimeters wide and up to 2 meters long at the mountain sites, dug wider and shallower below the tree line. Short fences of stone or brushwood run between them to steer an animal into the gap. The target is wild reindeer and further south elk. They were never built one at a time. In the Dovre Mountains, Per Jordhøy measured and satellite recorded at least 1,547 individual pitfalls in 2 systems. A survey published in 2025 in the European Journal of Archaeology located around 1,500 previously undocumented pits in Arctic Sweden, roughly 1,000 of them inside a single block of 228 square kilometers. Individual systems run from 40 pits to well over 300. The chronology comes from an unusually solid piece of work. In 2020, Andreas Hennius of Uppsala University assembled about 370 radiocarbon dates from excavated Swedish pitfalls. And the curve that produced is not the one the popular version predicts. Construction climbs from around 1800 BC surges in the 5th century AD, peaks around AD 650, then declines through the Viking Age rather than during it. Whatever drove the boom, it was not the fur trade of the sagas. The problem is what the pits are pointing at. Jordhøy's argument is the interesting one. The systems sit at valley crossings, and the individual pits are oriented with their long axis across the direction of travel, not along it. Read that. Way the holes are not a list of hunting spots. They are a recording of a route. They describe reindeer moving east to west between summer pasture and winter grazing, through the same corridors for thousands of years. That migration no longer happens. It has stopped completely. The lines of pits are now the primary evidence for where the animals used to go. And the reasons the route closed are entirely modern ones. A railway and a highway laid across it the wrong way. And then, the technique changed. In the second half of the 13th century, AD on the Hardanger Plateau, hunters stopped relying on pits. Sveen Indralid and Anne Karin Hofthammer of the University Museum of Bergen documented what replaced them. Long drift fences of closely spaced cairns funneled entire herds not into holes, but into lakes, where men waiting in boats killed them in the water and dragged them ashore. It is a brutal method and an extremely efficient one because a swimming reindeer cannot run and cannot fight. At Sumtangen, on the shore of one of those lakes, the bone middens around 2 stone huts amount to roughly 50 cubic meters. The minimum number of reindeer represented is 5,500. The likely figure is closer to 7,800. Radiocarbon dating indicates the whole operation ran for less than 50 years. The truly unsettling part is the comparison. 3,000 years of pit trapping left a record so diffuse that it takes systematic survey to find it at all. 50 years of the new method left 50 cubic meters of bone at a single lake shore. The excavators attribute the end of it to the herds being harvested past recovery, and to the animals changing where they went afterwards. The dating of any individual pit is genuinely weak, and the specialists say so plainly. Organic material rarely survives inside them. Most dates only establish that the hole existed before a certain point, and charcoal in a pit fill often came from somewhere else entirely. We can trust the aggregate chronology. We cannot trust a single hole. Norway banned pitfall trapping of elk and red deer in 1863 and of wild reindeer in 1899. By then, the technology had been in the ground for 3,000 years. The pits are still out there filling in slowly, and we now use them for the one purpose their builders never intended, which is to find the paths of an animal that no longer walks them. Number 4. The Arroyo at Olsen Chubbuck. On the 8th of December, 1957, 2 amateur archaeologists named Jerry Chubbuck and Sigurd Olsen noticed bone weathering out of a dry gully in eastern Colorado. Joe Ben Wheat of the University of Colorado Museum excavated the site in 1958 and again in 1960. What came out of it is still one of the most legible events in North American prehistory. The gully is an old arroyo, roughly 60 meters long, 3.5 to 4.5 meters across at its widest, and about 2 meters deep. Around 10,000 years ago, a herd of close to 200 bison was driven into it. The animals went in at speed. The ones behind went in on top of the ones in front. Wheat found the deposit in 3 layers, and the layers are the point. At the bottom lay 13 complete articulated skeletons that nobody had touched. Above them, carcasses partly worked. At the top, bone fully disarticulated and stripped clean. Butchery intensity increases with height because the animals at the bottom were crushed and pinned and physically could not be reached. Beside the arroyo were 9 piles of bone stacked in order. Front leg units at the base, then pelvic girdles, then rear legs, then vertebral columns with skulls placed on top. Hyoid bones. The small arch that anchors the tongue were set aside in separate piles of their own. Somebody wanted the tongues. That stack is a recording of a procedure, not a description written down afterwards by an observer, but the physical residue of the same sequence of cuts performed on animal after animal, discarded in the order the hands worked. We can read the orders of operations off a rubbish heap 10,000 years old. Wheat calculated the yield at somewhere near 25 tons of usable meat. He estimated that around 100 people could complete the butchery in half a day. Eating 2/3 of it fresh inside a month would take roughly 150 adults and children. 16 newborn calves in the assemblage put to kill in late May or early June. What makes the plains different is that the arroyo was not the technology. A gully cannot catch anything. What has to be built is everything upstream of it. The apparatus that delivers 200 animals to one specific gap in the ground, moving fast in the right direction on the right day. At Head Smashed in Alberta, that apparatus survives. A sandstone cliff about 10 meters high. Drive lanes several kilometers long, marked out by rows of stone cairns. Beneath the drop, a bone bed reaching something like 11 meters deep. The site was in use from about 5,800 years ago until 1850 and has been a World Heritage Site since 1981. The full extent of this was only mapped recently, and it is extraordinary. In 2014, Maria Nieves Zadino and colleagues published a survey of the Two Medicine River Valley in Montana, recording more than 14,000 cairns, stone rings, and associated features. The Kutoyis complex alone holds over 3,000 of them across 16 square kilometers, with a driveline system 4 kilometers long. A neighboring complex has a funnel 5 kilometers long, spread over 20 square kilometers. The cairns sit 3 to 5 meters apart all the way. That is landscape engineering carried out on foot by people with no draft animals and no metal. And nothing in the standard picture of pedestrian hunters prepares us for it. And the reason for it is storage. Work at Kutoyis found processing features and a pattern of bone fragmentation consistent with rendering grease out of the bone itself, which is the most labor-intensive extraction there is and the basis of pemmican. The kill is not a meal. It is a winter. The surplus is what lets several hundred people gather in one place at all, and one campsite in that complex has 651 stone rings in it. Not every bone bed is a jump, and the discipline has corrected itself on this. A reassessment of Bonfire Shelter in Texas concluded that the famous deposit there is a processing area, holding transported cuts from about 24 animals, and not the oldest bison jump on the continent. The cairns are still standing out on the grass in lines running to the horizon in places. There is something haunting about how little they look like anything. To a driver on the highway, they are a scatter of rocks. Number 3. The traps that made a coast richer. Nancy Green began mapping wooden stakes in the intertidal mud of Comox Harbor on the east coast of Vancouver Island and kept at it for years. When she published with David McGee and Roderick Heitzman in the Canadian Journal of Archaeology in 2015, the survey had recorded and mapped 13,602 individual stakes. The estimate for the total present is between 150,000 and 200,000. Those stakes resolve into 323 separate fish traps. 57 radiocarbon dates put the complex between roughly 1,300 and 100 years old. There are 2 designs, and they do not overlap. Heart-shaped traps run from about 1,240 to 840 years ago. After roughly 700 years ago, they are replaced by a chevron form. And the changeover lines up with the onset of the Little Ice Age, and with a shift in the fish turning up at regional sites. The first design is read as built for herring. The second is read as built for salmon. When the ocean changed, the architecture was redesigned to match it. At low tide, you can still walk out over the stumps of them. Along the same coast are structures that are not traps at all, and they are the reason this entry sits where it does. Clam gardens are rock walls, built along the low tide line, deliberately, to hold sediment behind them. Radiocarbon work published in 2019 on 9 sites off northern Quadra Island shows them in use for at least 3,500 years. The obvious assumption about any harvesting technology is that it draws a population down. We take the system loses, except that is not what the measurements say. In 2014, Amy Grosbeck, Kirsten Rowell, Dana Lipovsky, and Ann Salomon compared 11 clam gardens with 10 unwalled beaches and ran a 160-day transplant experiment with tagged juvenile clams. Little neck clams in the gardens occurred at about twice the density, with 68% more biomass. Butter clams occurred at around 4 times the density, with 253% more biomass. Transplanted juveniles grew about 1.7 times faster inside a garden than outside one. The numbers are not close. The mechanism is not mysterious. The wall catches sediment. The beach slope flattens out behind it. The band of shoreline sitting in the tidal range, clams prefer, gets wider and stays wider for as long as somebody maintains the wall. It is habitat construction, and we can measure it now on walls built thousands of years ago. A study in 2019 followed the same coast much further back using growth increments in butter clam shells across 11,500 years. Harvest pressure becomes visible from about 5,000 years ago. From about 3,500 years ago, when the gardens appear, growing conditions hold steady at a level matching the best natural beaches. After European contact with logging silt in the water and the management stopped, the clams shrink back toward sizes last seen at the end of the Ice Age. The fish record points the same way, and the numbers behind it are extraordinary. A survey of 171 coastal sites and 435,777 identified fish bones found herring present in 169 of them, making up 49% of all identified fish with relative abundance, varying by under 10% within 96% of individual sites. Thousands of years of that against a modern herring fishery that has collapsed and reopened repeatedly inside a single lifetime. Ours is the anomaly. There is even a mechanism visible in the bones. Ancient DNA work published in 2021 sexed 116 salmon vertebrae from sites in Bird Inlet and found a statistically significant bias toward males in chum salmon at 2 of 4 sites. Spawning males are visually obvious, hooked jaw and red mottling. A weir is the one technology that holds fish alive and sortable while somebody decides what to keep. Taking males preferentially raises the sustainable yield because a single male fertilizes many females. The boundary matters here. What a midden measures is what people ate, not how many fish were in the water. And the same researchers who published the stability findings have also published evidence for resource depression on this coast. The argument is live and honest on both sides, but the walls are going back up, now rebuilt by the nations that built them the first time. The clams are responding exactly as the archaeology said they would. Number 2, the desert kites. Seen from the air across a band of arid country, roughly 3,500 kilometers wide, the same shape keeps appearing in the stone. It runs from Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan through Armenia, Turkey, Iraq, Syria, Jordan, and Israel into Saudi Arabia and Egypt, 2 long walls converging. At the point where they meet an enclosure, we call them kites because that is the shape they make from above. The Global Kites Project, a French-led survey that ran from 2011 to 2024, recorded 6,721 of them. The dimensions are the first thing that stops making sense. Start with the walls. Driving lines run from a few hundred meters to 5 kilometers. The enclosure at the end has a median area of about 1 hectare. Set into the ground around its edge are pits up to 4 meters deep, anywhere from 1 to more than 20 per enclosure. In the basalt desert of the Harat al-Sham, the density reaches 1 kite per square kilometer. An animal driven down the funnel never sees a wall closing. It sees open ground, then a shallow enclosure, then a hole it is already falling into. In southeastern Jordan, a team including Mohammed Tarano Wael Abu Aziza and Remy Cressard excavated part of a chain of 9 kites strung across 17 kilometers of desert. 10 radiocarbon dates and 18 luminescence measurements place construction in the second half of the 8th millennium BC. The pit traps are 3 to 5 meters across with 1.4 to 1.8 meters of surviving depth and probably closer to 2.5 when new. They were cut into limestone bedrock and lined with dry stone walling. Some driving lines run 3.5 kilometers. Then there are the plans. In 2023, Cressard and colleagues published 2 engraved stones in Pilos 1. One is a limestone monolith from Jebel al-Khashabiyeh, about 80 centimeters long and weighing 92 kilograms. It is carved in low relief with 2 converging lines, a star-shaped enclosure, and 8 small, round cupoles, exactly where the pits belong. The other from Jebel az-Ziliyat in Saudi Arabia is a sandstone boulder, nearly 4 meters long, carrying 2 kites at once. Compared against real structures nearby, the engravings work out to scales of roughly 1 to 425 and 1 to 175. To build something kilometers long that cannot be seen from the ground, somebody had to hold the entire geometry in their head and then get it out of their head and onto a rock to scale. Neither engraving has been dated directly, and that limit is worth stating plainly. The Jordanian stone is dated by charcoal from the deposits around it. The Saudi one has no date at all. But here is where the arithmetic turns. At Tel Quran in northeastern Syria, within 10 kilometers of several kites. Guybar Uz, Melinda Zeder, and Frank Hole analyzed a bone deposit. They published it in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences in 2011. Around 2,600 Persian gazelle bones, overwhelmingly foot bones, out of a layer of the 4th millennium BC. The mortality profile is the finding. Every age class, both sexes, calves, prime adults, and old animals all together in the same deposit. Selective hunting does not produce that. A whole herd taken at once does. The truly disturbing part is what is not in the northern Levant now. The Persian gazelle is gone from it, extirpated across a range it held for the whole of the Holocene, and the argument in that paper is that repeated whole herd removals, century after century, are what set the decline running. Two objections deserve to be heard properly. Leora Kolska-Horwitz pointed out that gazelle numbers fall at exactly the moment human settlement expands, agriculture spreads, and the desert dries. And separating hunting pressure from habitat loss inside that tangle is not straightforward. The second objection is structural, and it is sharper. Not one kite anywhere has produced a bone bed, and we have been excavating them for decades. No stratified weapons, no slaughter. Deposit nothing. The recent excavation of those Jordanian pit traps recovered almost no animal bone at all. So the largest hunting machine our species has ever built is on the present evidence, a machine with nothing inside it. 6,700 structures, 5-kilometer walls. Pits cut into bedrock reused for hearths in the late Neolithic, then under the Abbasids, then under the Ottomans, by people with no idea what they were sheltering in. The most unsettling thing about the whole system is that everything in it survived except the herds it was built to take. Number 1. Budj Bim. In 1841, George Augustus Robinson, the chief protector of Aborigines in the Port Phillip district, traveled through Gunditjmara country in what is now southwestern Victoria and wrote down what he was looking at. An immense piece of ground trenched and banked, channels running for some thousands of yards across at least 15 acres. He was a colonial official with no particular sympathy for the people whose land he was crossing, and he recorded it because the engineering was impossible to ignore. The terrain he was standing on had been made by a volcano about 36,900 years ago. Give or take 3,000. The mountain, the Gunditjmara Col, Budj Bim, erupted. The Tirandara lava flow ran roughly 50 kilometers south toward the sea, blocking the Fitzroy River and Darlot Creek. It drowned the drainage and left a broad, shallow, seasonally flooded wetland spread across a rough surface of broken basalt. A landscape with a gentle gradient, a great deal of water, and a very large number of natural gaps. The animal is kuyang, the short-finned eel Anguilla australis, and its life cycle is the reason any of this exists. Adult eels leave fresh water and swim out to spawn in the sea. In 2019, researchers fitted satellite tags to 16 adult females and tracked them up to 2,620 kilometers out toward the Coral Sea near New Caledonia. The young come back. Every year in both directions, enormous numbers of eels move through that wetland, and they move through the low points. What the Gunditjmara built is a system for deciding where the low points are. Channels cut through solid basalt to move water between wetlands. Weirs and dams of stacked stone to hold it where it is wanted. Natural sinkholes and depressions used as ponds to keep eels alive until somebody needed them. Woven funnel baskets set into gaps in the weirs, and the height of a weir chosen so that undersized eels pass over the top and keep going. The system sorts as it catches. Nothing about that last detail is decorative. Eel numbers are falling across much of the world today, and a weir that lets the small ones through is the difference between a harvest and a clearance. The dating comes from a 2012 study by Ian McNiven and colleagues published with the Gunditj Mirring Traditional Owners Aboriginal Corporation, named as a co-author. 16 radiocarbon dates from a single channel feature at the Muldoon's Trap Complex indicate that the bedrock channel was cut at least 6,600 years ago. The stone walls above it were built roughly 600 to 800 years ago, and blocks were still being added within the last few centuries. That figure carries a real limit. Basalt contains no carbon, so nothing here dates the stone itself. Every measurement is on charcoal from sediment that accumulated inside a channel after somebody cut it, which makes 6,600 years a minimum age inferred from a fill, and the same sequence produced dates running back to 8,870. Nobody has dated the construction directly, and the excavators say so themselves. What makes Budj Bim different from every other entry in this countdown is the direction of the change. Every other trap here removes animals from a system. This one moved the water. It is not a device placed in a landscape. It is a landscape edited over thousands of years, with hundreds of tons of basalt, shifted by hand to redirect a flood that arrives every winter. The World Heritage property covers 9,935 hectares. In the southern section alone, there are 18 stone dams and weirs, and 7 excavated channels and around 129 stone circles have been recorded across the wider system. The contested part is what all this makes the Gunditjmara. Peter Sutton and Karen Walsha argued in 2021 that the volcanic terrain does much of the work by itself, and that year-round settlement in one place is not established. They do not dispute the date, and there is an honest gap in the record. The only stone house excavated and published from this landscape dated to the middle of the 19th century, with iron nails and bottle glass in the fill. No pre-contact stone dwelling has yet been securely dated anywhere in the system, and the archaeologists who published that house said exactly that themselves, none of which touches the water. Over the summer of 2019 and 2020, bushfires burned more than 7,000 hectares through the park and took the bracken and grass off the stone. Underneath, unrecorded by anyone, was another channel about 25 meters long. A century of survey had walked over it. The fire read the ground better than we did. In July 2019, Budj Bim was inscribed on the World Heritage List, the first place in Australia listed for Aboriginal cultural values alone. The Gunditjmara hold that country under native title. They run the rangers. They are named as authors on the archaeology, and they still take eels there. That is what makes the end of this countdown extraordinary, and it is not the age. Every other trap here is a thing people stopped doing, and what survives of them is whole stakes, cairns, and stone with nothing moving through it. This one never stopped. 6,000 years ago, somebody looked at a lava flow with water running over it and decided the water should go somewhere else. If you stand in that wetland now and watch which way it moves, you are not looking at a ruin. You are watching a decision that is still being obeyed. If you want to see more videos like this, click the video on screen now and make sure to subscribe.